You can work for British Petroleum and organize and protest against fossil fuel subsidies. This whole argument that our core being needs to be aligned with our jobs and our political interests need to be aligned with our jobs is a great way of making sure we alienate everybody that has to work in jobs that aren't so great for the world at the moment.
Welcome to Hunter's War, a podcast about the intersection of war and society. I'm your host, Hunter. Today, I'm joined by Grant Ennis. Grant has spent the last decade working on public health issues in Singapore and Paris. Before that, he was based in Iraq, leading the work of the Norwegian People's Aid in Syria. He's also a scholar and author of the eye-opening book that we'll talk about today, Dark PR: How Corporate Misinformation Undermines Our Health and the Environment. In this conversation, Grant and I get into why individual action isn't enough, how we can organize for genuine impact, and most critically, he exposes the playbook corporations use to perpetuate unhealthy food environments, road fatalities, and global warming. If you've ever asked yourself why the world seems to keep getting worse, even when we know how to solve it, this book will give you the answers. And because I believe in this book, I'm giving away a copy to the first 10 listeners who email me. Just listen out for the countries Grant and I mentioned we've met up in the last decade or so. Put that in the email, and I'll send a book your way, no matter where you are. If you have any questions or suggestions, my email is hunter@hunterswar.com. Now let's talk with Grant. We're going to need to do more of these, but today the goal is really to talk about your book. I got it right here. You can see I took some notes.
Wow, you took some notes. Oh my God.
The pretty version hanging out in the back, but the one that I've ruined and written on here. But I want to start with something that I say this respectfully. Your book is very uncomfortable to read. It's very uncomfortable to read. And that's why it's important. It gets at the heart of what a lot of us want to achieve. Literally, this podcast, the goal of it is to understand our own individual agency and building a more resilient society, hopefully reducing the violence at a global level, but really beginning with the individual and the actions we could take. I read this and I want to throw myself out the window, not the book, because the book's super helpful. I want to throw myself, right? It really is something that is important for everyone who truly wants to achieve impact. And I'm going on this little diatribe because I want to set why we're having this conversation and why for me it messes the whole thing up in a good way. I'm going to read one little piece. I think this is in your conclusion. You have, many of us have spent years, even our whole lives, trying to make the world better. However, coming to terms with the idea that our tactics are ineffective, misdirected, and even harmful is as transformative as it is depressing. We must make the world a better place, not feel as though we are making the world a better place. Tell me, what is dark PR, and also what is catastrophe by design?
Right. So I think dark PR is a term that I realized hadn't been used a whole lot before the book came out. Dark PR was kind of an up and coming term to refer to the way that PR efforts were being used in very malicious ways. And I realized that it was also a good way of describing what I was trying to talk about. I don't really know to what extent you could say there's a firm line between normal PR and dark PR. The idea that you try and convince people through public relations that something is better than it actually is inherently a little problematic. I think in the best case, you could say that people are trying to show the best side of a product or service or person or organization, more accurately represent the way a political position. But no matter how you look at it, all PR is still trying to influence the way people see the world. The catastrophe by design is the term I used in order to describe how governments have policies that lead to harm. So, like if you allow children to have guns, for example, and then you subsidize the price of guns, as I think the United States does in both of those categories, that was a catastrophe by design. You're setting up society to fail and to have a gun violence crisis. I look in the book at three catastrophes by design, the subsidization of unhealthy food. We subsidize sugar, we subsidize all kinds of unhealthy food, making it cheaper for people to eat unhealthy food, which leads people to eat more unhealthy food and then get more sick. And then we also subsidize driving. So if you subsidize driving, people drive more. People drive more. That means they live further and further out from one another. Then they're more stuck and dependent on driving, and you have more car crashes. You have more car crashes, car crash deaths. You have more pollution, more fossil fuel emissions. So that's another catastrophe by design. And then I have the third one as global warming as a catastrophe by design, because we're subsidizing global warming. 7 trillion US dollars per year. A trillion is such a large number. People don't even know how many zeros is in a trillion. It's an enormous sum of money. We are creating global warming through our taxes, and through the expenditure of our governments. That figure, $7 trillion per year, is from the International Monetary Fund.
In the book, you kind of break it down in two main categories. One, the frames, or the 9 devious frames. I'd love for you to give an overview of those. And then you do the other side, which is citizen activism, which is ideally the what we can do about it. What are the categories of frames, and how are they used by industry to do what you just mentioned and drive some of this negative impact?
I say that the way that industry protects these catastrophes by design that are very profitable, it's a lot of subsidies, a lot of money to be made from these subsidies, is by using dark PR. And I say there's a playbook of 9 frames that are used the same across all issue areas by industry. And so these 9 frames, they start out with what I call the big lies. The first one is just denialism. A second is post-denialism, where we say what's bad is good for you. Famous example of this is Guinness is good for you. The sugar industry used to say you can lose weight if you eat more sugar. Tobacco would say, like, doctors recommend you smoke these cigarettes to make your throat pain go away. Fossil fuels are good for us, is, believe it or not, something that the fossil fuel industry says. So you have this post-denialism. It's not just bad. It's not that it's not bad. It's actually good, is what industry will claim. And then normalization is the third of the what I call the big lies. It's where you take something that's highly problematic, the obesity pandemic globally, an unhealthy food environment, and you say that people that are getting sick from the unhealthy food environment are actually normal. And, you have the fat acceptance movement. So you have, I mean, it's shocking. Burger King promotes the fat acceptance movement. You have Nestle promoting the fat acceptance movement. You have companies that make ice cream and chocolates promoting fat acceptance. They're normalizing an unhealthy food environment. I make an important distinction there between normalizing and destigmatizing. We don't want people to be stigmatized for being the victims of an unhealthy food environment, or anything for that matter, but neither do we want to normalize that harm. I go to great lengths to make sure that I'm not cruel to the people suffering from the unhealthy food environment in the book. And I think that's very important. The case of global warming, you had the fossil fuel industry do focus group research to determine that we shouldn't be calling it global warming. We should call it climate change.
Yeah.
And they found that if you call it climate change, people are less likely to demand political action. So that's a way of normalizing global warming. And then for road deaths, for car crashes, the term accident
Yeah.
has this normalizing effect. So those are the 3 big lies. The next 3 frames are what I call panacea frames, or panacea frames. They're kind of solutions that industry proposes that don't really deal with the underlying problem much at all. You have the first one being what I call the silver boomerang. So people that are suffering from the effects of an unhealthy food environment are told to lose weight, just exercise more. But if you exercise more, you're more hungry, so then you eat more. Coca-Cola has been sponsoring the Olympics since 1929, I think. And so you have a really long history of promoting exercise as a solution to weight loss, rather than a healthier food environment that wouldn't incentivize people to eat such unhealthy food. For car crashes, you have industry saying, like, we don't need people to drive less. We just need more safety technology. But what we find is that with safety technology, as people feel more safe, they tend to drive more dangerously. The offset isn't perfect. And I don't mean to say that we shouldn't, like, promote exercise or safer cars. I just mean to say this narrative is being used to distract us from fixing the food environment, removing the subsidies for sugar, removing the subsidies for driving, and instead they promote these other solutions. And then for global warming, we're told that we need more efficient gadgets. But when we get more efficient gadgets, we tend to use them more. I don't know if you've ever seen the very old refrigerator, for example, but they used to be a lot smaller because they used to take a lot more electricity. As the technology has gotten more efficient, refrigerators have grown, our devices have grown. We used to have small cars that you would get the same fuel mileage or fuel efficiency as large cars today. You know, a large car today has the same fuel efficiency as a tiny car from 30 years ago. So our cars just got bigger and bigger. The next frame is the magic frame. And this one I don't actually enjoy talking about very much because it's so ridiculous. Like this idea from industry that you could just pump CO2 back into the ground. They call it carbon capture storage. There's a study that came out, or I don't know if it was a study or a report, I think last week, that the largest carbon capture storage plant in the world isn't capturing enough emissions to cover its own emissions for daily operations. Shocking. The other magic frame would be genetic solutions to diabetes, blaming people for their genetics for diabetes and then saying the solution is some kind of genetic cure. Or for road deaths, the autonomous car, rather than reducing subsidies for driving. And then the last of the panacea frames is the treatment frame. So rather than prevent the problem from occurring, we just need to provide more insulin to the people suffering from diabetes. Rather than preventing car crashes, we just need to provide more ambulances. Rather than prevent global warming, we need to adapt to it. For all these things, it's not that we wouldn't want these things if they were true. If an autonomous car could save lives, that'd be great. If carbon capture storage worked, that would be great. We definitely want ambulances. We definitely do want insulin for the people that are suffering from diabetes. We definitely do want to adapt to global warming. It is happening. These narratives keep emphasis on these solutions rather than the things that would really make a difference. And we often will hear, but we need to do both. We need to
Yeah.
do both. This comes up all the time. But political will is zero sum. So you either voted for Brexit or you didn't vote for Brexit. Or you either voted for Trump or you didn't vote for Trump. It's like one or the other. You can't do two things at once. So your media focus, your rhetorical focus as like activists or organizers or the bad guys, whoever you are, you're going to have an objective. And if your objective is to prevent global warming, you need to be focused on the prevention and not on all of these other side things. Otherwise, you're going to fragment your political push. So we can't really do both for framing. In practice, of course, we need ambulances. But in terms of when we're on stage and we're saying, what are we going to do to, save lives? We want to be saying, fix the food environment, not provide more insulin.
That's what's sometimes hard for people to hear. And you touch on the psychology a little bit in the book on that wanting to find the middle ground, that there's that human, and you're going to get to these frames a little bit, but the multi-stakeholder stuff and the multifactorial stuff, right, that it's complicated. But I think that was one of the really big takeaways for me, which is the need for focus. You called out the Colombia kind of peace referendum and it just being slightly percentage-wise missing, Brexit slightly percentage. And you realize the group that wins in a environment of lots of options is the one that benefits from kind of lack of action or its ability to focus on something. And you talk about the protest movements as a signal of the change and how they have, if you just look at the slogans from the early days of protests, and it was the people involved and the things they wanted. And now you get TikTok quotes or whatever, not to,
Absolutely.
Diminish the current ones. But that was a big takeaway for me, that maniacal need to focus on what you're trying to achieve. Because I'm guilty as well of the but let's do more, let's do all, let's include. And that really moves us away from getting to solutions.
Totally. There's a great article called F Nuance. And the author, his last name's Healy, I believe, talks about how there's a incorrect assumption or a fallacy that people believe that nuance is a virtue. Things being complex or complicated, seeing it from that angle is virtuous. There's no inherent virtue to making things more difficult to understand. It's important to like acknowledge nuance when it exists, and it's important to acknowledge complexity that exists. But we don't want things when we're trying to make decisions, we want things to be less complicated. We don't want more nuance. So the aim of a communicator is to make things more simple so people can take action. The more you make things confusing or nuanced, the let's do both, the less you prioritize, the less you focus, the less you get anything done. And we need to get things done. These are pressing, important issues. I think you touched on a really important element there.
Again, just thinking about the how I'm processing this book, the frames are a great way to understand how, in this situation, corporations are leveraging certain tactics to distract that focus, while on the other side, they, not to do the big vague they, but if we talk about a tobacco company or BP or whoever, there is a very clear focus, and it's profit. And it is one that they can focus on in all efforts. And in order to achieve that, I think as individuals or groups or collectives, these frames really help people see that they're being pushed away from it. The one that maybe to talk a little bit about is the victim blaming and the consumer action, because you hear that a lot. And I know we got some history in terms of the consumer fashion or ethical eating and some of that. Talk to me about victim blaming and how that drive to have the individual solve all of the world's problems moves us away from the goal of actually solving.
Yeah, thank you for highlighting this. That's the step. That's the seventh of the nine devious frames. It was probably the impetus for the book, actually. This frame of victim blaming or individualization, or sometimes it's called responsibilitization, is when we keep the emphasis of the problem on the individual rather than the politics. So overweight, obesity, and diabetes are population level public health issues. Car crashes, road deaths are a population public health issue. They're political because our government political decisions lead to these things happening. We're subsidizing road death, we're subsidizing global warming, and we are subsidizing diabetes, overweight, and obesity, and all the other associated health consequences of an unhealthy food environment. And so these political problems are being shifted in the discourse onto the shoulders of the individuals, usually the individuals that are suffering most from them. And that's very, very sly. It works very well. Examples of this is when you hear people say choice, we need choice, or individual agency or free will. But what happens when you shift or put any focus at all on the individual is that you end up with less political support for changing the politics. If you ask 1,000 people before exposing them to individual narratives, if you ask them, like, do you support ending the subsidies on fossil fuels for global warming? And then you expose them to carbon footprint messaging after they've been exposed to the carbon footprint idea, where they're doing both the carbon footprint and they think they're doing the political stuff, they'll be less likely, like out of 1,000 people, less people will be as supportive of ending subsidies of the political change than they would have been otherwise. There's a great example with women's rights where if you expose women to the message, you need to lean in more to succeed professionally. You need to lean in more to do well in life. The women exposed to that messaging will be less likely to support equal pay policy. They'll be less likely to support government action that would actually lead to women's rights improving. And we know this is the case for every issue I've looked at, but in the book I cover those three issues very thoroughly: diabetes and obesity, road death, and global warming. So if you look at food labels, for example, if you more we tell people the solution to an unhealthy food environment is for the food to be labeled better. That argument that you're putting it into the media that we need better labels. That argument is placing the responsibility for eating well on the label reader, not on the political system. The more people are exposed to that, the more people hear, oh, we need more labels so that people can make good choices, the less likely they are to support things like banning the sale of Coca-Cola in schools. The less supportive they would be of that kind of thing. Or exposing people to a media campaign that says, remember to eat less sugar today, or drink less soda, taking people and putting them in education classes where they can learn to eat better or learn to drive better or learn to watch their carbon footprint. These kinds of narratives lead to less support for political action. And things like the carbon footprint, I think people don't know, but it was actually something amplified and essentially, in terms of popular understanding of it, was created by British Petroleum. now called Beyond Petroleum in a post-denialist shift. So BP took this term that was only existed in obscure academic journals and popularized it in the early 2000s, and it took off. The people that did this effort, they went around the world with their little video camera in the early 2000s asking people, what is the carbon footprint? And you can see these videos on YouTube. They're fascinating because people are responding to the questions of the interviewer like, what is that? What is the carbon footprint? What is this thing? And they're laughing like it's a joke. Yeah, BP did a fantastic job. And the guy that did the PR campaign, the PR expert that did all the focus groups and stuff and did the filming, he actually has it on his website to this day, talking about how he did this. It's incredible. So the carbon footprint is a corporate scam. And no, we can't be doing both. Exposing people to both messages leads to less support for political action, such as ending $7 trillion in fossil fuel subsidies.
You make the distinction between the information environment and the material environment, right? That they want to get us to focus on this side where the real change comes from this side.
Exactly. Yeah, the material environment is the real environment around us that shapes how we decide things. So that's like, what is the price of things? How much do things cost? So that's why a lot of activists are always talking about like carbon taxes or soda taxes or you name it. But you also have the temporality in the material environment. So like we don't sell alcohol or cigarettes to children. Some kinds of shops are closed after 2 a.m., famously bars. The age or the time of day are policy mechanisms that shape the material environment. And then you also have the proximity between human beings and the thing, such as the distance between your house and the nearest McDonald's, the distance between your house and like a park. So like if you have parks that are close to your house, you're more likely to walk. You're less likely to drive. If you're less likely to drive, you drive less. If you drive less car crashes. So the proximity of things around us, and you use less energy. So the proximity of things around us, the price of things, and then the temporality of things are kind of the triad that I focus on for what I call the material environment. And the corporate interests would rather us focus on the information environment. Labels, marketing bans, media campaigns, education, with the idea being this kind of idealistic vision of reality where human decision making comes from within rather than without, which isn't based on any evidence. So like every time you look at the evidence on this question, it's very clear. It's the external factors that shape human decision making. The claim that internal factors, that the information environment shapes the human decision making is only ever backed up by what are called self-reported statistics. So it's like people, you ask them like, hey, now that you like heard about the carbon footprint, do you now like have a smaller carbon footprint? And they say, oh yes, definitely I do. You know, like, or now that you learned that sugar is unhealthy, do you eat less sugar? And people say, oh yeah, definitely. Thanks. I'm so glad I was told. Now I won't have that cake.
And we want to believe it. I think we want to believe that our individual impact leads to something. If you think about the food labeling or the decision not to fly, I think about in Europe, and I'm curious your thoughts on that. They've banned a lot of short haul flights versus the idea of just getting communal peer pressure to fly less. It floats around a lot that we think we can, as an individual, have aggregate impact. And what I think you point out is less so.
Yeah, as individuals taking these decisions, it makes no impact at all. The law that makes it so that the short haul flights don't exist anymore. I mean, that's a great law. That's wonderful. That's a much better thing than having a couple of people individually choose not to fly quite so much, or placing the blame on people to get them to fly. Just that they should feel responsible. That argument ends up harming our effort to achieve things like the ban on the short haul flights. In aggregate, all of our tiny actions can lead up to something big. Is a conflation of aggregate and collective that I make in the book. I don't expand on it, but I think it's a very important point, this aggregate action versus collective action. People mix them up quite a lot, even very well-meaning people. Aggregate action is this idea that if we all just independently cut the soda thing to prevent the sea animals, the turtles from being hurt, if we all individually do that in aggregate, more turtles will survive, versus a ban on the little plastic things. That would be collective action. Collective action would be just not producing this product to begin with. And in aggregate, we're never going to get anywhere. It never adds up to anything significant. And you have industry promoting this aggregate action under the guise of collective action all the time.
I mean, again, that's why I started with. I'm guilty of it in my own thinking, in the goal here, and thinking often about the conflict piece, and that we as individuals can work together to build a more resilient society. And we can, but we are saying and pointing out is the importance is the collective action and the organizing. And that is the fabric that then pushes against government decisions rather than to hit the last three. It's complex. There's a lot of factors involved. We should think about all the factors. There's a lot of people involved. We should sit together in a room, right? Like some of these things that we think are us just getting a better understanding of the problem, which in reality might be us moving slower and further away from the goal of creating change.
That's the eighth and ninth frame. So the eighth frame I call the knotted web. I think it might be easier to think of it as complexity or circularity. These kinds of terms, they give the patina of sophistication to somebody, and when they're talking, they make it sound like they're really smart. There's some Canadian former spies actually wrote a piece called Complexity Bias. And they refer to complexity bias as humans being inherently inclined to believe things are complex. And that we like to see things as complex, but it doesn't get us anywhere. People that like the idea of complexity or like the word and you want to use it, but realize there's a problem with it, they might be better served by using the word like structural. It's a structural problem, or it's a root cause kind of problem. Another way of saying complexity is actually systems. So it's a little bit problematic to use the word systems. I try to avoid it, but that's one that's also quite commonly used in a very good way, but it's
Why are
got
you trying to avoid
implications.
it?
Well, systems and complexity are kind of like interknottedness. They're like things are so interconnected, whereas structure is like, this is the shape. Structure is, here's the base. This is how it works. Systems, kind of, if imagine a spider web without the things that the web is latched to. Like a spider web exists because of the walls, the structures, not the lattice work. The lattice work is interesting, but it's not really shaping the scenario. Systems framing creates this image in the mind of a bunch of interconnected balls and lines rather than a clear-cut structural diagram where this causes this causes this. People that are in favor of complexity like to say like, oh, it's not linear, it's not so simple. Ideally, a systematic perspective on something would be when you first starting to understand a subject and you notice that there are a lot of moving parts and you're like, wow, this is really confusing. But that would be like the naive first step in understanding. And it's fair enough to acknowledge there's a lot of stuff going on, but you need to move beyond that in order to make decisions. You need to find the really important variable to tweak in order to make change. Fossil fuel subsidies. The more people say global warming is complex, the less we're going to get anywhere to stop it. We need to find the things that are really causing the most emissions and target them and prioritize those ones and go after them and stop them. Complexity doesn't help us to prioritize. Regardless of whether or not you buy my explanation for all of that, the evidence on how people getting exposed to the narrative complexity are affected is pretty solid. The more people hear it's complex, it's complex, it's complex, the less people are going to be supportive of clear-cut action. And there's a very documented track record of industry using complexity narratives. If you look at ExxonMobil's like 1997 campaign against the Kyoto Protocols, which our generation remembers this Kyoto Protocols thing. It's like, whatever, it's long in the past. They were saying, oh, climate change is so complex. No, we shouldn't be doing something so simple as the Kyoto Protocols.
Yep.
And you see it with every industry using complexity narratives. And a lot of researchers mix what I call the complexity narratives, which are the knotted web narratives, which is the eighth frame, with my ninth frame of multifactorialism. They see them as one, but I broke them apart. Multifactorialism is this ninth frame where you're saying the problem has a lot of moving parts. The problem is not caused by any one single thing. So the tobacco industry, we know that they started using this in the 70s because of leaked memos to researchers. There was this memo called the Panzer memo or the Roper proposal, and it's called by both names. And basically the memo says, hey, this thing with denying the role of cigarettes in lung cancer, it's not going to work forever. we need to try something else. Let's try multifactorialism. So let's say like, oh, like lung cancer is caused by lots of things, stress, genetics, it's caused by all this stuff. And that was very successful. And then, like the sugar industry, I mean, not the entire sugar industry, but I think Kraft and a couple of other companies were purchased by tobacco interests. And then you see them using the same narratives. It's multifactorial. So multifactorialism for diabetes is like diabetes is caused by genetics, as you said, or it's caused by not exercising enough. Diabetes is a multifactorial problem. You hear the sugar industry saying that all the time. Beyond Petroleum, or BP, created this thing called the all of the above strategy. So we shouldn't be just targeting, like not extracting fossil fuels from the earth, but we have to try everything all at once, all together. We need more efficient devices. We need carbon capture storage. And also maybe we should, or what's that other thing? Not extracting fossil fuels. Let's not talk about that one. But all industries use this multifactorial thing. They combine the devious frames together.
On one side, it sounds intelligent. You can do a panel about it. You can do a conference. You can support an organization as BP that invests in sun energy without distracting from your goal, which is get money from fossil fuels coming out of the ground. A lot of these, and that's the whole book, is about kind of corporate disinformation tactics or frames. But as I read it, I kind of keep thinking what sounds like the goal in all of it is the government's decisions on where to spend money and energy and time. And you touch on that too, where corporations kind of learned or began to focus on themselves. The CEO kind of example of blame them, take the blame, get them out, because then they can keep moving forward, and it distracts from the subsidy they're getting, the advantage they have, the ability to just sell massively sugary drinks, let's say.
Exactly. And focusing on the individual CEOs, or focusing on individual corporations, identifying the bad corporation or the good corporation, or the bad politician or the good politician, distracts us from all politicians and all CEOs and all corporations are interfacing with the same incentive structures. And it's those incentive structures that we need to be changing. We don't want the politician that isn't corrupt, because that politician, the non-corrupt politician, is still going to be in a situation that is corrupting. And it's those incentives that are corrupting that need to be addressed. We're not gonna win if we try and support the good corporations, punish the bad ones. It's not a solution. It's not about BP or Coca-Cola or bad politicians. It's about changing the laws that are making people bad, and changing the laws that are making corporations act the way that they're acting.
Not to comment too much on U.S. politics, but we just had the officially named Big Beautiful Bill Act pass the House. And in that is an incredibly large amount of money, or tax cuts, both. And that will drive industry. That will drive individual actions. And as much as we do a lot of kind of campaigning and messaging around other things, in the end, the trillions, I was going to say billions, but the immense amount of money that is coming through the U.S. government will drive the actions of people, no matter what their intentions were coming in. I want to pivot slightly to the second part, which we've touched on a little bit, but collective action and its enemies. What are the enemies of collective action?
So we need people to be real. Collective action is when government acts, because government is kind of the forum through which we act collectively as society. So then we need people to organize and demand government act. That's collective action. So we should be seeing that happening. But to prevent that, we have a couple of narrative enemies of collective action. One of them is what's called electoralism, this idea that democracy is voting and nothing else. Democracy is like the freedom of association, the freedom of assembly. You have all these other kinds of important elements to democracy, but this focus on voting ends up eroding that, and decreasing the likelihood that people will participate in citizen groups. Even, it's kind of very unfortunate. You see this a lot in the United States. You tend to only see political mobilization around electoral campaigns. So there's this idea that you just need to get the right political candidate into office, and then everything will be fine. So then you see all these people getting really mobilized only around elections, and then the person they wanted to be in place is in place, and they sit back and wait and just hope everything works out, because now they've done their bit. That's not democracy. That's not how change happens. The best example for this is the women's suffrage movement. So women didn't have the right to vote. So they didn't vote themselves the right to vote. They organized, they demanded political action. That included protests, that included engaging with policymakers, that included letter writing campaigns, that included writing newspaper columns, books, all different kinds of tactical things, but that were being done under the strategy of we organize and we demand political action. The next enemy is continuing from the first is what I call mobilizationism, this idea that we just need to protest. The image of people protesting has eclipsed political organizing. People think they just need to go and be one of a million at a protest or one of 1,000, but really you need to be one of five. You need to be one of like five people in a small political organization that you and your friends. You don't need to be registered. You have the right to association. But we don't see that. We don't see people meeting twice a week with the same group of five friends, figuring out how they can influence politics, figuring out how they can organize and ally with other groups of five people. Instead, we have this belief that people just need to show up 12th Sunday of the year, protest once, and expect policy change to happen. That's not how it works.
You had a moment in the book where you talk about density of housing and the impact that that had on so many things, which blew me away. Obviously, road deaths, health, but you connected also to collective action and coming together as groups, because if you are in low density areas, you don't necessarily know your neighbors because you're hopping in a car, the restaurant's in a different location because of zoning laws. I mean, I have the luck of living in a city, you do as well, but at the same time, cities are changing and becoming less dense, and was that moving us away from organizing?
Absolutely. Cities around the world are all, by and large, less dense than they were 100 years ago. And this decrease of densification is rather scary. If you look at the data on political like party participation, you'll see that the right wing of the political spectrum in any country of the world is always going to be living in rural areas. And then the left wing, I mean, this is a generalization. You of course have left-wing people in rural areas and right-wing people in urban areas. But by and large, you tend to see support for right-wing policies in rural areas or lower density areas, and support for left-wing policies in more densely populated areas. This de-densification of human settlements is not something where people have just decided to live in less dense areas. Low density living is government mandated. It's very profitable for people that sell concrete, automobiles, and fuel to have society structured in a way that requires everyone to drive all the time. These low density settlements, there's two kinds of what we call human capital, bridging and bonding. It's the main kind of like what division of human capital. So bridging is when you're running into people on the street repeatedly and you build a friendship and a rapport with people you don't even know. Bonding is what happens when you organize something on the telephone, then you drive to their house with somebody, and then you hang out with them at a specific location that's like pre-planned. You're reinforcing an already existing connection. So people in rural areas or lower density areas tend to bond more. So you have really strong connections with fewer amounts of people. People in cities have weaker connections with larger amounts of people. And this bridging concept is really the thing that leads to people becoming more what would tend to be left wing, to support more like political action and these kinds of things. People that live in rural areas tend to be more inclined to believe that they're responsible for their own agency, they're responsible for their own lives. You see more of this kind of thing in communities where people have more bonded social capital. But also, political organizing tends to happen the closer people are to one another physically. And so the lower density that our human settlements are all set up in, the less people are likely to organize politically. The most successful social movements in history, you think of like the labor movement and women's rights movement, they all happened in urban areas. And I talk about this quite a lot in the book, and I provide a lot of sources for anybody that wants to fact check this, because it sounds quite like I'm making wild claims here, but it's fairly well established.
And maybe then to touch on, kind of getting toward the end here, but on the international piece of it. So somebody might, based on our accents, assume all of this is only relevant to the US. You've lived a number of places. You've looked at all of these issues from multiple countries' perspectives. Talk to me about how how international these are, both these frames and the impact, whether it's within Syria or even on things you're doing today in Paris.
The lens through which I did the research behind the book and wrote the book was international. It was written entirely outside of the United States. Yeah, for those that don't know you, Hunter, and I, they wouldn't know. But like for all those that are listening, the last time I saw Hunter was in Belgium. The time before that was in Iraq. Time before that was Kenya. Time before that was Guatemala. Time before that was Honduras. So the amount of time we've spent together in the United States is very
Stockton. I
little.
saw you a couple times in Stockton.
We went roller skating once. I remember
What?
that.
In Monterey? No. Where?
In Monterey.
Nice. Yeah. Okay.
But yeah, the lens for the book and the research behind it was all international. These framing techniques, they've been tested internationally. This thing with the way that humans associate or don't based on density, you see the same everywhere. The role and increasingly the influence of the automobile industry, the sugar industry, the road building industry, fossil fuels. It's got a really deleterious effect everywhere, countries all around the world.
And you chose these kind of three main issues. But if we think about conflicts or the way certain things are framed in Ukraine, Russia, Israel, Hamas, the framing is similar, maybe not always from a corporation, but from a group. And you talk about the structure of charities, for example, having an impact on that. But it is corporations that are using these frames to change our thinking about these three issues.
Absolutely. I mean, charities, especially charities that are funded by like British Petroleum or funded by the automobile industry, amplify these narratives. Politicians that are on the take, research institutions. It's quite scary.
For people that do want to do better, right? That's why I mentioned it's an uncomfortable read, because I think a lot of people want to make the world better, and they don't always understand, myself included, how we are falling victim to some of these frames and not moving forward.
And you wanted the book on the tactics.
It's coming. It's coming, right?
I think you might want to interview a guy named Vincent Bevins for his book, If We Burn. And he does a great job of talking about the social movements of the last 15, 20 years. He travels the world during that time and wrote about his experience working and talking with different activist groups everywhere. And he made a really, I think it might not be the crux of his book or of his argument, but it was the one that I found most insightful. Was he found there was this kind of organizing principle called prefiguratism that was dominant in all of these social movements, that after these like last 20 years, most of the organizers he had been working with all realized was flawed, that nobody would want to do that if they did it all over again. It's this idea that we should be living today like the future world we want to live in is already established. So live as if the political structures that we're seeking already existed. What that means in practice is these political social organizations, these social movements that are seeking collective action, have been so adverse to hierarchy, so adverse to formality, and so in love with horizontalism rather than verticalism, that they became impotent. They were incapable of acting strategically. It's almost as if they heard the term divide and conquer as we should divide up into tiny parts and then conquer, rather than if we divide ourselves up, we will be conquered, which is what prefiguratism does. You have to fight the divide and conquer. You have to fight being divided. And we need more what Vincent Bevins calls verticalism, I believe. We need structured, formal, hierarchical organizations to push back against the structured, formal, and hierarchical, organized, well-funded industry bodies that are continuing to push for the continuation of fossil fuel subsidies, that are continuing to push for all these other horrible things that we're seeing around the world. We need to have organizations that are structured in a way that can fight back. Another person who wrote a lot about this was, it's one of the most famous feminist pieces that exists. It's the Tyranny of Structurelessness is the name of the article that she wrote. This article, the Tyranny of Structurelessness, is fascinating. It's written in, I believe, 1971 by a really fantastic feminist, Joe Freeman, who wrote the other piece, The Personal is Political. The Tyranny of Structureless makes the same case that all of these small feminist organizations and even larger feminist organizations, they would always lose if they tried to maintain themselves as structureless, because structurelessness always ends up leading to the pursuit of structurelessness ends up leading to the denial of informal structures that become formalized. But because you're insisting that you're structureless, you can never call out. Really wonderful short piece, probably like 10 pages or something, whereas Vincent Bevins's book is 400. So you might want to start with The Tyranny of Structurelessness.
And that is, and maybe it's slightly adjacent to it, but it makes me think about the purity test piece, right? On top of the horizontal, but then people challenge each other on their purity, and you can't talk about environmental stuff because you took a plane last year, right? And you get two well-intentioned people arguing about who's doing better, best on their carbon footprint. Where I think what your book puts back in perspective is that doesn't matter.
Doesn't
It
matter.
doesn't matter.
Arundhati Roy, the Indian organizer, activist, author, actress, amazing, amazing person. She says it very well. She says, the whole idea that in order to change the world, you have to be a saint first is a great way to make sure that a whole lot of people are not political. You completely remove people from organizing when you insist that they have to be perfect first. And I talk a lot about how we need to be embracing and encouraging incongruence. Like people, you can work for British Petroleum and organize and protest against fossil fuel subsidies. This whole argument that our core being needs to be aligned with our jobs and our political interests need to be aligned with our jobs is a great way of making sure we alienate everybody that has to work in jobs that aren't so great for the world at the moment. I think we really need to stop pursuing congruency and embrace incongruency.
I think that might be a good spot to round off because it's a reminder for people that no matter what they're doing, they can go grab somebody else or join a local organization or get together and start to think about, and especially for me, the decisions being made by government at a local level, at a regional level, at a federal level that touch on these topics that I find important that we all do. So, Grant, as always, I appreciate it. I would recommend, obviously, to everyone the book. Where can they find you? Where can they find the book?
They can find me on LinkedIn or Blue Sky, and they can find the book wherever you buy a book. It's on Audible for audiobook. It's on Amazon. You can buy it from the publisher, which make the publisher very happy. You can go to Daraja Press to their website.
Cool. Grant, I appreciate it. Thank you for the time.
Great to be here, Hunter. Thanks a lot.